Joining us this morning is Alexander M. Haig, Jr. Good morning, Mr. Haig.
My pleasure, Eliot.
What your goals were as a child? Did you ever see yourself being in the position four-star general? We can go on here. Let me go through the list because it's so extensive. Everything you have done and been involved in has touched every American that is probably 30 years or older. Deputy Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy-Johnson administration, Deputy National Secretary and Security Advisor to President Nixon, Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, White House Chief of Staff to Presidents Nixon and Ford, Supreme Commander of NATO, and now you are the President of one of America's largest multinational corporations, Secretary of State under President Reagan. Did you ever expect this as a child? What were your goals?
Well, Eliot, I've been very, very fortunate, or unfortunate as the case may be, having been exposed to so many of our national crises since the Second War. My ambition was, of course, the military, and I went to West Point from a fatherless home and saw in the military great opportunities in which there would never be the kind of regional prejudices that sometimes one confronts, and you advanced in accordance with the work you did, and good luck. And I guess I had a share of both of those, but I never did visualize being a White House Chief of Staff or even a Secretary of State. I had hoped to be a leader in our military someday.
See various countries in Europe coming together, trying to have a common denominator for their money, for their economics. We see suddenly the breakup of regimes all over the world that were previously of a communist or socialist nature. There are people that believe that there are people high up around the world that are working together in collusion, that are hoping that eventually all the countries of the world will come together in some kind of one world order. So I have to put this very first question to you. Do you see any evidence of this? Do you believe any of this? I'm sure you have heard these theories.
Well, indeed I have, and I think the important thing to remember is that the most fundamental change that we have seen is a collapse of Marxist-Leninism in the Soviet model and the liberation of Eastern Europe. Now, these are profound and fundamental changes in a world. But the world itself, as you suggest, is becoming more interdependent. And that means that communications, the explosion of information sciences, have now tightly bound us together. And if you have a downturn on Wall Street today, it'll be felt in every financial capital of the world within 24 hours and reflected there. So we are intimately interrelated more than we have ever been. In addition to that, the bipolar world has collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of Japan, a united Europe, a free trade agreement between our Canadian and Mexican neighbors, and the extension of that into the hemisphere, and the profound changes in the Pacific Basin. Here is where the action is. Japan, now the second most powerful economic bloc in the world, the four tigers of Asia, soon to be joined by Malaysia and clearly Thailand, and not too soon, not too far distant, Indonesia, and a superpower China by the middle of this coming century. So this is a changed world. Does it mean there is a new world order? I am a little skeptical of that, because I think people tend to equate that with some fundamental change in the dangers that face nation states. And we have to remind ourselves that there are still a group of nations that do not believe in rule of law and peaceful change, but rather believe in the rule of the bayonet. We see that in the Middle East with Saddam Hussein, possibly Iran. No question about Libya still being a terrorist state. So the dangers are there. And the transformation of the former Soviet Union into a successful democratic CIS is still a long distance away, with many, many dangers, and a lot of nuclear weapons still within their control, and the largest armed force in the world still under their control. So there's no reason for complacency, but certainly the world is a better place than it was just a decade ago.
Will the United States always remain within its own autonomy? Will it, whether the rest of the world decides to come together, if we see this economic bloc in Europe, anything it appears these days, Mr. Haig, looks like it could happen. Who would believe that Eastern Germany would suddenly put its borders down and quickly become part of a unified Germany? I could see Europe all of a sudden deciding, let's get rid of our independent countries and become one big thing called the New Europe or something. Will the United States, as far as you know, always maintain its own autonomy?
I see trends on both sides of that question, both of which should be a matter of concern. First, if you look at today's campaign, as we're also concerned about, you see protectionist and isolationist trends both in the extreme right in the Republican Party and in the extreme left in the Democratic Party. This is one of the things that concerns me about this campaign, because the candidates are all talking about the need now to turn to solve our domestic problems, and indeed they need a lot of attention, and they have been neglected for too long. But at the same time, when they suggest to the voters that we can do this at the expense of maintaining our leadership role abroad, then they don't understand the nature of this new world. This is a world in which our exports, our trading position, is the paramount contributor to our future economic growth. It has been over the last 3 years, as lackluster as it's been. So what the candidates should be telling the electorate is that I'm going to stay part of this world, which is getting smaller and more unified, and I'm also going to pay attention here at home, which we've been unable to do or have failed to do. But you cannot do one at the expense of the other. You have to do both, or you're going to fail at both. Now, having said that, there have been a number of hiccups recently in the trend towards unification, for example, in Europe. There's strong nationalism developing. You see it now in former Yugoslavia. You see it in the vote against the Maastricht by the Danes, and the near miss in France recently. You see growing tensions between our Western European partners reflected in the near term against Germany, because they're beginning to blame the economic downturn on the Germans, which is a bum rap, but nevertheless, no, we're a far cry from a unified world. The trends are moving in that direction as a historic matter. But I think there are still many, many obstacles. And what is important is that we Americans remain leaders in this world, where we remain relevant politically and above all in economic and trading terms. And that means to submerge these protectionist trends that are running wild in Washington today.
If you had your hand involved in the Nixon debates, I don't know if you advised any of these people at all.
Well, I did. And as a matter of fact, I was involved in 3 presidential debates within the Republican family in 1988 when I was running for our candidacy of my party.
So what did you think last night? Did you?
I thought the participants all did a good job. I thought that the winner was Ross Perot, because he's a no-nonsense populist who goes right to the people's concerns and suggests a fundamental impatience with business as usual, or a failure to cope with our problems. He took most of the win from George Bush, because George Bush is the incumbent and therefore is the representative of status quo, and I think the post-debate polls have sort of reflected that. I don't think Clinton improved himself one way or the other, except in the relative decline of George Bush, who was far better in foreign policy than was Clinton, and Clinton was far better than Bush in domestic policy. Clearly, Clinton is a young man with a young mind who has taken his script, if you will, and managed to learn it. But I thought both Bush and Clinton were just a little stale, a little lackluster, and that gave quite an opening for Ross Perot, my old friend.
Ed Eschen, you are on with our guest, General Alexander M. Haig.
Hey, good morning, Eliot. General
Hello.
Haig, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I had a two-part question for you, sir. One is, what is the role of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, and what has been your role in that organization? I'll take the answer off air. Thank you.
Okay, Ed, thank you.
The Council on Foreign Relations is another one of these think tanks which exist all around the country. There are 4 or 5 here in Washington alone, and I'm part of 3 of them. The Foreign Relations Council is a council that David Rockefeller's had a heavy role in. It's now run by Pete Peterson, probably the most conservative economist in America of the current crop. It has from time to time sort of reflected the views of the establishment, and by that I mean it's far more moderate than I am, or more liberal than I am and have been. But I decided to join it because I wanted to make a change. I wanted to bring some, what I call more moderate influence to it. I'm sorry to say I've only partially succeeded, and I'm not very active with it, but I have been a member, as have a number of top American officials of both parties.
Do they have an agenda at all, Mr. Haig, or do you think this, as you say, it's a think tank and they are open to all ideas?
Well, I think they're open to all ideas, but their membership is drawn heavily from the New York academia, from the liberal community in New York and the Northeast, where these thought modes are rather prevalent. They're not of my basic thrust in mainstream philosophic thinking, which is far more conservative. But there are many conservatives that belong. I can tell you, every year the United States Army sends their brightest young colonels up there as fellows. So they do very fine work. And I'm not one of those that believes, as some suggest, that the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations are subversive bodies in our body politic. They are not at all. And this is a rumor and, frankly, unsubstantiated.
Okay, let's go back to the phones. You are on with our guest, General Alexander M. Haig, Jr. Good morning.
Good morning, General Haig.
Yes.
You know, my big concern is a responsible free press, and of course a few men in our recent history have been handled so cruelly and roughly by the press as you have, which gives you an exceptionally keen insight as to the forces regarding the energy behind our press. And I'd like to hear your comments, if you'd be so kind, as to share with us your viewpoint is how free is our free press and how accurate are they?
Well, they're only as good as their sources, and it's the sources that I would take issue with, not the press. For example, there are many of my military colleagues, after the frustrations of Vietnam, left that experience with the impression that the American press, especially the television, lost that war. Now, let me tell you, it wasn't bad press that lost Vietnam. It was bad policy. And to the press's everlasting glory, they knew it was bad policy. I would have a big argument with them as to their interpretation as why it was bad policy. They drew all the wrong conclusions, unfortunately. Now, most of that they came by as a result of who they talked to. And here in Washington, where you're right, I've been the victim of some bad press, which was launched against me, and I write about it in my book, by the men around Ronald Reagan, who saw me as competition for George Bush in the presidential race at some point. And they clearly had to wipe me out. And they did a damn good job of it because the press played right along with them. But that same press that was adulating Jimmy Baker all through the Reagan years is now beginning to suggest that he's failing in the Bush campaign. So there are no consistent press positions. There are bad sources and bad information. And we all know that the journalist trade in America draws an awful lot from the liberal community because it attracts them. But that doesn't make them anything less than objective.
Because with your statement that you made in regards to President Reagan's shooting, clearly the senior editors edited your statement that was aired to the public out of context.
You're exactly right.
And the question is, they had to know what you said because they're the ones that edited it. And the question is, I mean, are we then the victims of these senior editors who then will bend the public will to whatever the way they want?
The risk is there, especially in television that hasn't matured in the 200 plus years of our republic as the written press has. The written press is pretty well policed by its peers. The journalists police themselves. In the electronic press, this is just beginning to happen, and we had a big kickback reaction to the extremes of the electronic press over the last few years. I think we're in a society where those things do police themselves. We live in a dialectic, and the most frightening thing to me would be a regulated press or a regulated television. There's where real trouble develops, because politicians are generally the ones behind the bad press. That was the case the day the president was shot. Dan Rather was incited to do what he did, and that was to show only part of what I said and then claim that I thought I was in line to be president, which was ludicrous. It had nothing to do with the issue.
Well, thank you, General. And, you know, I would like to remark one thing. You have one of the best wits and one of the best humors of any of the public figures, I think, that are still in the land. So thank you much.
Thank you, Pete. We appreciate it. We are on the Eliot Stein Show. We are talking with Alexander M. Haig, Jr. Mr. Haig, I want to ask you, I remember as a child growing up, a baby boomer, Democrats and Republicans, and I remember they were all very patriotic, and your parents tended to be either Democrats and maybe your friend's family was Republicans, but they were all really trying to work for America. Is there a schism now? Is there extremism within the parties? Have the Democrats become too liberal? Have the Republicans become too conservative? What has happened?
Well, I think we live in a dialectic, Eliot. That means we tend to lurch from one set of views to another set of views. And from time to time, if we have been particularly unsuccessful with one set of views, we react rather sharply by adapting the other set of views on the fringes of the extreme. And I think we've had a real jolt here over the last 4 years in the economy here at home. And that jolt has tended to sharpen somewhat the so-called dialectic, and those that seek bigger government and more government management are now on the ascendancy. Although I see a degree of moderation on both sides, as we saw in the debate last night. I don't think either President Bush or candidate Clinton expressed extreme views. In fact, I was very, very pleased and surprised to see Mr. Clinton change his position on the People's Republic of China, for example. Very, very importantly. Up till then, he was equating the PRC with Saddam Hussein, as he did in his own convention speech. Yesterday he was talking about, or last evening, about the importance of keeping a dialogue, which I think is critically important to America's future and to the future of the People's Republic. So, no, I don't think we have lost our level of rationality. As a matter of fact, the great attraction of Ross Perot is a Texas populism in which the people see in him a no-nonsense guy who wants to roll up the sleeves and solve the problems of our economy here at home, which is the true issue. I think after Vietnam, for example, the conservatives became very, very strong. Ronald Reagan rode into office on the reaction of the American people to the excess, I would call it liberalism, that dominated the conduct of the war in Vietnam, where we failed to use our power and squandered the lives of 55,000 young Americans in a no-win conflict. American people recoiled against that. So we now have a situation where I think the next president is going to be tempted to think that the only thing that matters is jobs here at home and our economy, and it is the most important issue. But if he doesn't understand that the only way to deal with those problems here at home is to stay healthy and relevant and active and successful in our export markets abroad, if we're going to find ourselves scrunched at both ends.
Let's go back to the phone. Good morning.
Well, thank you, and I'm real honored to speak with you, General Haig, because I'm always watching you on Crossfire or something like that, so thanks for being on this station. My question, sir, is a what-if question. As an honored American general such as yourself, and you yourself, you know, who is, along with many other people in this country, put himself on the line for this nation in war, what would be your personal reaction, General, if Clinton, who's never served in a combat role, was ushered in and became Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and as last night's debate, when they were talking about Serbia, that he stated that he would not commit ground troops, but, sir, he left the impression that he would use air crews for combat missions. Would you make a statement on that, please?
Well, I make no bones about it. I'm very uncomfortable with Bill Clinton's position at the time of Vietnam, but I do know that it's only part of the picture and part of the whole man. There was a lot of opposition to the war at that time because the war was not being properly run. On the other hand, I've been even more concerned by his what I call equivocation and posturing on exactly what he did do and didn't do. And I find that very, very troublesome.
And like, you know, we shouldn't really patty cake on the issue due to the fact that I wish that President Bush would have pushed it a little bit more. The vice presidential candidate of Ross Perot is James Stockdale, who was a POW and who was also my CAG commander.
And a dear friend of mine.
Absolutely. And like I say, it's really I think this issue should really not be patty caked around because that guy last night, is that not true? Did you get that impression that he would be willing to send air crews in there?
Well, I can't say I drew that conclusion, but I wish Mr. Bush would either do it or not do it. He was too soft on his criticism on that issue. If you believe it's a problem, you ought to state it without any equivocation and just bang it out there and let Mr. Clinton answer the questions. As it was, he wiggled right off the hook last night because Bush was not forceful enough.
Sure.
And I know the reason he wasn't is because he's so self-conscious about being accused of a McCarthyite attitude. You know what I would have said when he said about Bush's father, Prescott Bush? I'd have said, yeah, but McCarthy was accusing innocent people of things they were not doing. You were guilty of this.
Right.
Now, would you explain it to the American people? That's what I would have said.
Very good, General. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll get to more calls in a minute. General Haig, let me ask you a question about something which people have heard in the rumor mill for years, and this is during the time when Mr. Nixon, as a president, was essentially being pressured to resign, and we knew he was going to. The press came out and said, well, apparently later today he is going to resign. And all of a sudden there were these rumors floating all over the country which said that he had considered essentially implementing some kind of martial law and taking over the military. Is there any truth at all to this?
None whatsoever. And, of course, interest on the subject of Watergate. I don't mean it at length. There was never a moment where President Nixon wasn't in full control of his faculties and abiding by his assessment of rule of law and our constitutional process. There was never a moment where the U.S. military, which is a democratic arm of a democratic nation, would ever consider undertaking orders which would have rejected due process, the rule of law, and our constitutional requirements.
That ends the rumor. Oh, I mean, for 20 years.
Well, I can tell you that it's like I said earlier to a caller, that was fed to the press by a member of the president's cabinet. And he subsequently was fired by Jerry Ford because Jerry Ford looked into it and had it investigated. And Jerry Ford was a great president. he just wouldn't tolerate a fellow like that in his cabinet, so he fired him.
The motion picture, All the President's Men, of course, you had Robert Redford, Dustin Hoffman playing Woodward and Bernstein, and the fun part of the movie for most of the American public was the insider who was supplying them with information from a payphone or from wherever, Deep Throat. What does it feel like being the man who all of a sudden is on the lips of everybody all over the United States saying, it was Alexander Haig, he was Deep Throat? How do you go home at night, Mr. Haig, and your wife says, what is this all about?
Well, Deep Throat, I do think there probably was a source that Woodward and Bernstein used. It's been I don't have evidence to definitely support it, and that he was probably a member of the FBI because they were the only ones that had the information so far ahead of everybody else. I also point out categorically that it could not have been me, because both Woodward and Bernstein, as well as myself, have confirmed that I never saw or talked to either of them till after Nixon resigned, and I never knew them. So it's just plain hogwash, and it was written by John Dean and then picked up by a more recent book written by a couple of sleazeballs who write everything incorrectly. But that sells books sometimes.
That it does. Let us go back to the phones. You're on with our guest, General Alexander M. Haig, Jr.
Good morning, Eliot.
Hello.
Good morning, General Haig.
Good morning.
I had the good fortune of serving under a protege of yours back in the late 70s, if you remember him, Colonel Nick Crotchew.
Oh, yes, I do.
Yeah. One of the things that they drummed into our heads at that time, General, was that the foremost strategic goal for the U.S. was to maintain and secure peace and stability in Europe. How would you handle this situation in Yugoslavia? Because I listen to shortwave, and that thing is deteriorating even more rapidly than what we're seeing on our normal news channels here.
Yeah.
It's going to spread if somebody doesn't do something, and damn fast.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I'm a Republican, and I basically support Bush's foreign policy. I thought he quit too early in the Gulf War, and there are differing views on that. In the case of Yugoslavia, I think the Secretary of State did not move out as crisply as he should have when the crisis developed. First, because he gave speeches which suggested to the goons in the Yugoslav capital that they could suppress the nationalist movements among the non-Serbian populations, and therefore it was sort of a green light. Then after it broke out, I think we should have moved very, very promptly in a multinational forum. That is, in the United Nations and, above all, in NATO, to insist that the Marxist holdovers in the capital of Yugoslavia, the Serbian leaders, just simply started to pay a heavier price than they did. Now the thing is in danger of really brutalizing the wonderful Muslim populations of the non-Serbian areas, or those mixed with Serbian populations. It's now got a Macedonian dimension in which the Greeks are going to be tormented. All the Muslim countries are very upset about this, especially our friends in Turkey. I don't think we can sit by idly. Now, would I recommend direct intervention either by air or by ground forces? My answer is no. I don't think we should get bogged down in there unilaterally, but we should be loyal and active and leading members of multinational actions that are taken to put some pressure on the Serbian leaders.
Oh, I can readily agree with that, General, because it appears that Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of the Serbs,
that's right,
has made a cold, calculated gamble that nobody's going to do anything.
Unfortunately.
What bothers me is twice this century we've been sucked into European wars, that we waited too long before acting.
Well, at the same time, when it comes to committing American forces and risking the lives of young Americans, it is absolutely essential, in my view, that you know that you are prepared to do all that's necessary to bring it to a successful conclusion, and that you can do that. And secondly, that you're going to give them all the assets they need to do the job. that we haven't done, drawing from experiences in Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and other places.
General Haig, with the breakup of the Soviet Union into various different regions or countries, and I'm sure that you can't even know, if you're a geography teacher, you don't quite know what to say, this is or this is. A concern that some of us have is we understand that from a military perspective that submarines are still being turned out, those that have nuclear capabilities, by whoever is still running the former Soviet Union. To your knowledge, is this still going on, and is this a major concern to you?
Yes, it is, of course, and of equal concern is not only continuation of the arms industry with producing tanks, nuclear submarines, but more importantly, nuclear weapons. There are still some 30,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. They've been distributed among 4 of the republics. We've been pressuring the CIS republics very heavily to eliminate these weapons, to get them centrally controlled, and above all, not let them be shifted to other third world nations. Now, there are reports today in the Washington press that some deal has been signed with Kazakhstan, which is one of the 4 republics that have these weapons, and Iran. Now, I don't know how true this is, but it is a matter of very, very great importance to American policy, and it seems to me we have to be very active in dealing with it. But again, it's very important to remember also that when a president is running for election and all the focus is on the domestic side, their span of attention is very limited. And I know George Bush well enough to know that this is highest priority for him. The question is his Secretary of State, who's now acting, Larry Eagleburger, and able to do as much as we should be able to do with the former Soviet Union republics, to be sure that they're not letting these weapons get shifted to other powers.
Good morning. You're on with our guest, Alexander M. Haig, Jr.
Yes, General Haig. I lived in Paris and you were my dad's boss. It was a real historical time. He had you as a boss, and then General Walters. And I was wondering what significant events were going on in Paris at that time when you were there.
Right. Well, when I was in NATO, the big problem was how to work with not only Europe in getting their act together to stand up to the Russians, and I think we did, and I think it made a major contribution to the changes we've seen. But it was also when I worked with Dick Walters, who was the attaché in Paris, and he's a very dear friend of mine. We were doing an awful lot on trying to wind down the war in Vietnam. We were holding secret meetings in Paris with the North Vietnamese, which Dick Walters set up and did the physical aspects of.
Do you remember Colonel Swanson?
Oh, of course I do.
Yeah.
A very fine man. You have to be very proud of your father.
Well, I do remember I read a book years ago that written by Senator Jeremiah Denton.
Yes,
and,
another personal friend.
Yeah, I recognized, even though it didn't mention my dad's name, when he mentioned the personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Paris and how helpful, how much they appreciated the help they were to the POW families.
That's exactly right, and they played a very key role in the negotiations which got our prisoners back and the negotiations which ended the war, which did not turn out as well as we all would have hoped.
Yeah. And then I guess for Eliot, I sure would like to hear General Walters sometime.
We'll try to get everybody on here.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Haig, let me ask you as the last question here. Where were you exactly? I mean, physically, where were you when you heard of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? What were your personal feelings, and what were your feelings of what you had to do because you were a public servant?
Yes, and well, I was devastated, of course, like every public servant and every American, terribly disturbed by the events. At that time, I was special assistant to the Secretary of the Army, Cyrus Vance, and worked with Joe Califano, the General Counsel of the Department of the Army. We were immediately responsible for all of the funeral arrangements associated with President Kennedy's internment, as well as a number of activities associated with the fact and the crisis itself. And I was intimately involved in the affairs of the Johnson administration in cleaning up what was a debacle, clearly.
Thank you so much, General Haig. It has been an honor to talk with you today. I appreciate our whole audience appreciates it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Eliot, and all your listeners.
Have yourself a wonderful day.